Joining us on Outsiders is #1 best-selling author Douglas Murray. So good to see you in person.
Great to be with you.
Let's start off with something we don't want to talk about. What's happening in France? It is grim. How do you see it? And has Macron got the right idea about how to tackle this?
You know, one of the things that people said a lot since The Strange Death of Europe came out in 2017 was, do you think there'll be a tipping point? And I always say, I don't really believe in tipping points anymore. I don't doubt they come along, but you really can't feel them as you're going through them. If we'd been talking in 2015, I'd have said the murder of the most famous secularists in France at the beginning of the year, the beheading of a priest while saying mass at the altar at the end of the year, those would be tipping points. Turned out, the French were able to absorb this, for better and for worse. I would have said that the November attacks in Paris with 130 people killed in Kalashnikov and grenade attacks in a single night, suicide bombings all around the city, I'd have said, well, that would be a turning point. So it's very, very hard to judge with France, as it is all across Europe. One thing I would say is a general point, but one that needs to be said, and perhaps it doesn't get said enough, and particularly in the English-speaking world, but the extraordinary resilience of France as a society really amazes me. I mean, in both of our societies, in Australia and the UK, we've had our own terrorist attacks and our own problems. But I think no country has suffered as much as France has consistently suffered in recent years from not just Islamist terrorism, but homegrown Islamist terrorism. And I just think it's worth noting that, if any of our societies had gone through this much, this often, I don't know if we'd have dealt with it as well. I felt when I saw President Macron's response to the killing of the school teacher, I wonder, actually, if a British Prime Minister would have been as tough in what they'd said. I wonder, I wouldn't like to guess for Australia, but I wonder whether we wouldn't have heard a little bit of, we've got to have respect for people on all sides. Macron didn't say that. No. Macron said the values of the Republic will not change.
We've seen Associated Press reports and New York Times reports in the US, Sky News UK, not this Sky News, I'm happy to say, basically making excuses for the terrorists, saying that they were provoked by France's aggressive secularist policy, and in effect calling for blasphemy laws instead of the universal free speech that was the mark of Enlightenment societies until very recently. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think there are two things going on here, two possibilities. The first is ignorance, extraordinary ignorance on the part of many commentators from outside of France. Many American leftists, and indeed secularists, have no idea of the foundations of French secularism. American leftism has morphed into this sort of rainbow coalition, be nice to everyone even if they're cutting your head off at the time. American leftism has gone badly off. It reeks at this point. It positively reeks. Now, French leftism doesn't. French leftism includes the ability to be patriotic and left-wing, and it knows what patriotism is. So outside of France, there are a lot of people who just don't understand the extent to which French right and French left are united in understanding the values of the Republic. So the first thing is that we see an enormous amount of ignorance, but the second thing is cowardice. And in the international arena, as nationally in America and our own countries, there are just many people who see the literal blasphemy police, no longer talking metaphorically, the literal blasphemy police, and they just want to make sure they're not on the wrong side.
But then what you're saying, is there in that answer possibly a way through for the rest of the West?
Yes.
I mean, insofar as nationalism and the idea that you can have a shared pride in a nation, could that be the way out for France to inculcate that in their Muslim populations, which they've done historically with populations from all of their former colonies, versus the left in, say, the United States, England, Australia, which thinks that the nation state is a terrible idea and they want to dissolve everybody into kind of a blancmange beyond all borders.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's an enormous amount we could learn from France. We don't even have to learn it. We can assert ourselves better. One of my great heroes, I'm not just saying this to pander, but one of my great heroes of recent years was that New South Wales police chief who some time ago had that same question everyone else had about the burqa. You know, should the burqa, can you drive and have a burqa, and if so, can you have a burqa in your driving license photo? Do you remember that row? Yeah. And the police chief said, well, the way I see it, you know, if your mode of dress is stuck in the 8th century, then so should your mode of transport. You can either have the burqa and the camel, or you can show your face and run by the rules of a modern society and drive a car. But this picking and choosing whenever it suits, there's something wrong with it. I think everybody knows this. I think it's very much just common sense. I think that certainly my own society in Great Britain, I think to a certain degree in Australia, as much as I've seen it, I haven't been there for more than a year, but there's this sort of loss of confidence in the just common sense response. You know, we all just over worry ourselves. But what if we're doing? When it comes to a fundamental attack on your values, like the murder and decapitation of a school teacher for asserting the rights of citizens in the Republic, no, that's when the whataboutery stops. That's when the "are we doing enough" stops. That's, you know, and then you see this obscenity in things like the New York Times. You know, maybe the French Republic somehow, because of its assertive secularism, caused this. That's when we don't engage in debate. That was it. No. No, you don't get to do that. Not on our watch. Not now.
But sadly, in the left, that is now considered the sophisticated, nuanced response to almost victim blame and try to find some sort of rationalisation for what's happening. And there is this unholy alliance between the regressive left and Islamism. They have nothing in common other than a shared hatred for Western civilization and conservative values, as far as I can work out.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the Islamist says, "I loathe your society and everything in it," and the leftist says, "What a good point you've got." It is an ugly alliance. But I'm not willing. I've never been of the left, or as I always say, if I ever was on the left, it was a matter of hours. But you know, I do think that we need a good, reasonable left in all our societies. A good explanation for how societies move and adapt is the left comes up with proposals, and the right negotiates them and works out which bit is good and which bit isn't, and pushes back accordingly, and you come to a sort of synthesis. If the left has gone completely off the reservation, then everything else in society fails as a response. And that's why, you know, it's not my tribe, but I don't want the left to be this anti-Australian, anti-American, self-hating. I don't want it.
But isn't the problem that that mentality now isn't just at university campuses, but it's in government departments, it's increasingly in the private sector, and popular culture, Hollywood. It's taken hold. That is now the dominant dogma, and if you don't submit, then you're a deplorable, you're a racist, you're a sexist, whatever.
And you can play this country by country as well, because I suspect, for instance, that you being Australian probably think that the British have like an extra grit, for instance, not to put up with certain stuff. Well, we have that same perception about Australians. And in a way, we each country by country have this. And so one of the disturbing things is always discovering, for instance, that common sense Australianism is on the way. Like you discover that the common sense British thing, if we're not putting up with that, is also on the way. So somehow in all our societies, we do need to learn something from the French, which is to say, as Emmanuel Macron did this week, if you don't like our values, go somewhere else. You're not welcome here. You don't have to be here.
On that idea of grit and resistance and liberty and all of that, I want to shift gears a bit to the lockdown crises around the world, and particularly in your home country of England, where Boris Johnson has just imposed a strict lockdown, having, like Santayana, forgotten his aim after he's redoubled his effort as he's forgotten his aim. What do you make of these societies, the Anglophone societies that were essentially the birthplace of liberty, now acquiescing, like we've seen in Victoria, in Australia, in the UK, to essentially house arrest for entire populations, calling them lockdowns, which is what we say about people who are in prison, over a virus which has, for the vast majority of the population, very little consequence at all?
That's right. I mean, I fear so many things coming from this. The horrible feeling I've had through all this has been that this is a prelude to something much bigger that hasn't even started yet. The first thing is this. At the beginning of the virus, we didn't know very much about it. We know quite a lot now, and we know all the people to whom it is basically not dangerous at all. It is obviously dangerous for certain parts of the population, and they need to be protected and to be able to protect themselves. But my fear is that we have spent everything we have in the reserves for a not that dangerous virus. I don't want to downplay it. Obviously, it's dangerous for a lot of people, but it isn't the virus we thought it was at the beginning.
It's not the Spanish flu. It's
not
the
the
blood
Spanish
death.
flu. It's not the bubonic plague, and so on. So I don't want to underplay it, but it isn't what we first feared it might be. This is the third such virus we've had from China in the last decade alone. I have no confidence that in the next decade China's going to stop giving us such viruses, you know? So what is it when we have spent all of our reserves on a virus like this? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, just seems very clear to me, we had the first lockdowns. As you say, my own country's going into a second lockdown. I think by this point we're way past the stage where you have to weigh up different virtues. I say we're not very good about this actually in any of our societies, but you know, nothing, despite what the sort of millennial social justice activists pretend, nothing is actually just straightforward good against straightforward evil, particularly when it comes to government policies about complex things like viruses. At the beginning, the virus and our health services took priority. Protect our health services, make sure they're not overwhelmed, and so on. And the economy was just left to hang. Now, at this stage, for some months, it should have been the case, we should have realized the economy cannot just be left to hang.
Yeah.
Now, at this stage, these are clearly competing values that we're talking about here. Economy and the public health. One cannot take complete superiority over the other for an extended amount of time. And it seems to me that with the second lockdowns, we are in the stage of saying that the economy can continue to be a second-order priority compared to the virus that is the main priority. And I think that is simply unsustainable.
That's the thing. I mean, is this a problem that people, so many people in the electorates of all of these countries, seem to have now decided that they are going to trade liberty for health and security under the auspices of the government, and they'll do whatever they say? And is the corollary to that, that by providing so much stimulus and so much payments to people to keep them going, that they then become addicted to that?
Yeah. I mean, my favorite stat in all of this was, I think, in late May, early June, 28% of the British public said that they wanted lockdown to continue even if the 5 conditions the government had set for it to be lifted were all met. You thought, what's that all about? Like a quarter of the public, even if the government said you can come out of their houses, would say no, not coming out again. Now, I think there are explanations for that. I think there are a small number of people in our societies who are genuinely very, very fearful of getting out of the houses, some for legitimate reasons, some not. And I think there are some people who, frankly, have found the last year more comfortable than perhaps it should have been. And I'm not being glib about this, but there are certain people, particularly in public sector jobs and other things, who, if you've got most of your pay coming in and you don't have to commute, and if you love your family and you're happy to spend time with them, then you know there have been some benefits.
nice
Big
holiday.
house on that
Yes,
is not a small council house or an apartment or something like that.
That's one of the other things, isn't
Yeah.
it? I mean, we've been talking obsessively about inequality in recent years without doing anything about actually having a serious discussion about it. But the left sort of bounced everyone into an inequality argument in the last decade. And actually, to the extent that it exists and it's something you can deal with, there can have been no greater inequality over the last months than, you know, a young person struggling in a flat they rent, crawling up the walls under lockdown, and older and better off people actually having a kind of relaxing time. I think it's going to have exacerbated generational divides, income inequality divides, and much more. That's why I say I think there are people who are going to have to remain safe, and there's going to have things that are done to look after them. But our societies just cannot be on pause much longer, or at all, I think. I think we just got to get out of this. This is a prelude to total collapse if this goes on. Total collapse.
And just lastly, is this all a symptom of the West having a fairly indulged existence for some time? Prosperity, peace, and very few coping skills, it seems, when real adversity comes along.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, at the beginning of the virus, I wrote some of that. I thought, it was, in a way, it would test our mettle as individuals as well as society. It sees what you can draw on in terms of reserves. I don't mean financial reserves, I mean moral reserves, cultural reserves. I think we've all been exceptionally bad at this. I mean, we live in societies where the church is asked to be closed. Asked to be closed. Imagine this in any previous time in history. In fact, in my own country, they didn't just ask to be closed, but the senior clergy just disappeared. As if they had no role. I think this, by the way, is a generation and a cultural mistake of epic proportions. But yes, there are a lot of bad signs in the air at the moment. A lot of bad signs. I think, if I may say so, that all of our societies have been lucky without realizing how lucky we've been. My late friend Clive James said once that he said that his generation, born in 1939, he said, we were like that Buster Keaton movie. Remember Buster Keaton standing in the doorway of the house and the house starts to come down. It turns out to be a fake set, a Hollywood set house. And he comes over and it just is. And I remember Clive saying, that was my generation. He said, the whole damn house fell in and it just missed us. Well, here's the thing. That was that generation. We forgot in this generation, our generation, we forgot that the whole damn house can fall in. We assume that if the whole damn house falls in, someone else comes and rescues us. And we've got lazy on it. And that's, unless you have an economy, you don't have anything else. You don't have the health service. You don't have any of these things. So there's a hell of a lot of work ahead of us. But the first thing is to realize that fact and to start getting out of this fast.